The summer sun bore down on the dusty grounds of Black Hollow Auction Arena, casting long shadows over the rows of bleachers packed with ranchers, investors, and curiosity seekers. The scent of sun-scorched hay, leather, and sweat lingered thick in the air. It wasn't just a horse auction. It was a spectacle, a marketplace where bloodlines were currency and reputation was everything. That morning, Willow, a deep chestnut mare with an almost regal gait, had been led into the pen beside her foal, Ash, a spindly-legged colt no older than 4 months, with a coat the color of embered wood and eyes filled with both wonder and caution. The crowd had watched them with polite disinterest. Too young, too green. Most weren't here for stories. They were here for profit. But someone else watched them very closely. Standing at the edge of the arena in a pristine linen shirt and polished boots was Rylandor Vexgate, a man as feared as he was admired. A former oil baron turned equine magnate, Rylandor was known for 2 things, his wealth and his ruthlessness. Where he walked, men stepped aside. Where he bid, others folded. He wasn't looking at Willow. He was staring directly at Ash. "Undisciplined," he muttered to the man beside him. "But with the right pressure, he'll learn." "They all do." The auctioneer, Masrick Flintmere, called for attention. Lot 31, Willow, pure-blood mare from Ashridge stock, open for private bidding. The colt is not up for sale at this time. Rylandor raised his number without hesitation. 22,000. For both. A ripple went through the crowd. "But, sir," Masrick hesitated, glancing at his clipboard, "the foal's not part of—" "It is now," Rylandor said coldly. "Unless there's an objection." People murmured. No one raised a hand. Not even Jorvan Ashridge, seated in the last row, his cowboy hat shadowing a face carved by years of sun and sorrow. His eyes locked on Willow, but he didn't speak. "Not yet." Masrick tapped the gavel, uncomfortable. 22,000, going once, going twice. Ash let out a tiny, confused cry. And Willow moved. She stepped in front of him, ears pinned back, muscles tight. She wasn't just standing, she was guarding. The gavel dropped. "Sold." The crowd began clapping, but the sound faded when Rylandor himself entered the pen. He held a wooden training stick, the kind used in groundwork, but known to become a weapon in the wrong hands. A few in the audience exchanged uneasy glances. Rylandor didn't break animals, he dominated them. He reached for Ash's halter. The colt flinched, and Willow lunged. It was instantaneous. She drove her body between Rylandor and her baby, hooves slamming into the dirt, nostrils flaring. A deafening snort burst from her chest as if the earth itself had spoken. Rylandor stumbled back, more shocked than hurt, his stick lowered, eyes wide. Ash froze behind her, trembling. The crowd went silent. Then came a voice. "That colt's not meant for chains," said a woman near the rail. Brixley Thorncroft, former field veterinarian and someone who'd seen war both overseas and at home. Her hand was steady, her voice even. "You can't take him. Not like this." Rylandor straightened, dusting off his shirt. "I paid for both. I'll do what I damn well please." More phones came out. A journalist, Dexlan Crowhurst, began filming from the third row, eyes fixed on the unfolding standoff. The footage would go viral before the sun even set. The auctioneer was frozen. So were the handlers. Then Willow let out a second sound, not a cry this time, but a low guttural groan, like thunder caught in her throat. Protective. Final. No one dared move toward her. Rylandor's face twisted. "She's dangerous. Remove her. Sedate her if you have to." But still, no one obeyed. Then, from the back, another man spoke, Tavrick Hollowand, young, sharp-eyed, the grandson of a once-respected breeder. He stepped forward from the shadows. "You can own a horse's body, Rylandor," he said, "but not its soul." and you sure as hell can't buy a mother's will. That stopped everything. People who had come for commerce were now witnessing defiance, not just from a horse, but from the hearts of those who'd had enough. Willow stood firm, tail flicking, muscles coiled, not as livestock, but as something far older. An ancient force. A protector. A mother. Ash pressed against her side, his small body shaking, but his eyes steady now, wide and watching. Learning. And across from them stood Rylandor, breathing hard, gripping a stick he couldn't swing, and staring into the eyes of something even he couldn't control. The arena emptied slowly, as if the crowd wasn't sure if they had just witnessed an auction or something sacred. Brixley Thorncroft stood at the edge of the fence, her hands still gripping the worn wood as her eyes followed Willow and Ash being reluctantly led toward the holding corral. They weren't separated, yet, but the tension in the air was sharp enough to taste. Willow's ears twitched back and forth, alert. Ash stumbled beside her, the dust clinging to his young coat like a warning. Brixley knew what would happen next, and she couldn't shake the ache in her chest. Rylandor Vexgate paced near the loading area, his expression unreadable now, as handlers whispered nervously around him. His reputation had carried him far, but today something had fractured. A mother's defiance had made the crowd pause. Worse, someone had filmed it. He had noticed Dexlan Crowhurst, that damn reporter, recording from the stands. The man was probably already sending clips to some bleeding heart news network. Rylandor clenched his jaw. The last thing he needed was sympathy getting in the way of control. In the corner of the grounds, Jorvan Ashridge watched silently from the shadows of the old barn. He hadn't spoken to anyone, not even Masrick, but his mind was far from still. Willow wasn't just any mare. She had been born on his land, under a sky full of thunder, and named after the only tree that had survived a lightning strike that summer. He remembered the night vividly, and the man who had once stood beside him when she was foaled. That man had vanished years ago, but the bloodline hadn't. And now the past was circling back like dust in a storm. Brixley found herself walking toward the holding corral without realizing it. Her boots crunched over gravel, her mind racing. She hadn't touched a horse in 3 years. Not since Afghanistan. Not since the blast that ended her medical career and her ability to sleep through the night. But something about Willow, about how fiercely she shielded her young, pulled at the part of her that hadn't died overseas. She stopped just short of the gate, where the mare raised her head and stared at her. Not afraid. Not angry. Just watching. Measuring. Inside the auction office, Masrick Flintmere reviewed the sales documents with shaking hands. "He's going to demand we enforce the transfer," he muttered. "But this is different." People saw. The intern beside him nodded nervously. Outside, murmurs were spreading. Some said Rylandor was cruel. Others called Willow dangerous. But no one could deny what they'd seen, a mother choosing war over surrender. And in the fading light, Dexlan Crowhurst uploaded the video to his editor with a single line. "This isn't just about a horse. It's about who we become when no one's watching." That night, Brixley couldn't sleep. The image of Willow lunging in front of Ash replayed in her mind over and over. It wasn't just the act, it was the intention behind it. There was something ancient and noble in that moment, a silent language that didn't need translation. She sat alone at her kitchen table, a steaming mug of chamomile untouched in her hands, staring through the window into the dark Carolina woods. There was a pull in her chest she hadn't felt in years, a call to protect, to intervene, to do something before it was too late. But she wasn't sure if that part of her still worked. At dawn, she drove back to the auction grounds, passing long stretches of mist-covered pastures and sagging barns. When she arrived, the place was mostly empty, save for a few handlers and a sheriff's cruiser parked near the office. Her heart skipped. Thalric Gorswell, the county sheriff, stood leaning against his truck, arms crossed, watching 2 stable boys loading feed. Brixley approached slowly. Thalric had known her since high school, back before life had turned sharp and complicated. His face softened slightly when he saw her. "You're not here to buy anything, are you?" he asked, his tone calm but weary. "Not exactly," Brixley said. I need to know what happens to that mare and her foal." Thalric sighed, adjusting his belt. "Technically, they're both Rylandor's property now. He filed the papers first thing this morning. Claims she's aggressive, wants her transferred to his private facility for behavioral correction. The colt's scheduled for weaning and training by the end of the week." Brixley's stomach turned. She looked toward the far end of the property, where the temporary stalls sat in quiet isolation. She imagined Ash being separated, Willow's panicked cries, the cold precision with which Rylandor would break the spirit of a baby. Her fists clenched. "There has to be a way to stop it." Thalric hesitated. "Only if there's a legal basis. Abuse, mishandling, or proof that the sale was invalid." He paused. "Someone would need to speak up. Someone who knows the horse's history." As if summoned by fate, a low voice spoke behind them. "I do." They turned. Jorvan Ashridge stood a few feet away, his weathered face unreadable, but his voice steady. "That mare was never meant to be sold with the foal. There's more to this than what's on paper." Brixley looked at him, heart pounding. For the first time since the auction, hope flickered, and far off in the stall, Ash let out a small, lonely whinny, unaware that his future was now in the hands of strangers with something to prove, and demons of their own to silence. The office was quiet except for the soft ticking of an old wall clock and the low hum of the ceiling fan. Jorvan Ashridge sat across from Sheriff Thalric and Brixley, his hat resting on his knee, his eyes fixed on a spot that no one else could see. The silence felt heavy, like something sacred was about to be unearthed. Brixley leaned forward slightly, her voice cautious. "You said there's more to this, Jorvan. What exactly do you know about Willow?" Jorvan exhaled slowly. "She was born on my land 5 years ago. Her dam was a mare named Rhea. Strong, fast, but wild. I was never able to break her. She died foaling Willow during a lightning storm, same night my brother disappeared." He paused, eyes narrowing. "My brother was Rylandor Vexgate. Back then, he still went by Ryland Ashridge." Brixley blinked. "You're saying Rylandor's your brother?" "Half-brother," Jorvan corrected, his voice flat. "He hated the ranch, hated the work, the horses. Said they were just tools to be mastered. When our father died, I stayed to run the land, and he vanished. Changed his name. Made his fortune. But Willow, she was always a reminder of the bloodline he left behind. And now he wants to claim her, not out of love or need, but because she's a symbol of everything he thought he was better than." Thalric shifted in his chair, his brow furrowed. "You're saying the sale's tainted because of a family dispute?" "No," Jorvan said firmly. "I'm saying Willow was registered under my name, and the papers Rylandor submitted list the foal, Ash, as unclaimed property. Which is a lie. That colt isn't just any animal. I bred him. I named him. And Rylandor has no right to either of them." Brixley's heart raced. There it was, legal ground. Something they could use. "If we can prove ownership, we can challenge the transfer." Thalric nodded, standing up. "I'll issue a temporary hold on their removal. But this will escalate fast. Rylandor doesn't lose quietly." Outside, the sun was beginning to fall behind the horizon, casting a deep amber light over the stable yard. In one of the far stalls, Willow lifted her head, sensing the shift. Ash lay beside her, breathing slowly, unaware of the storm swirling just beyond the barn walls. And in a private office miles away, Rylandor Vexgate stared at a freeze frame from the auction footage. Willow's body between him and the colt, and muttered to himself, "That mistake should have been broken 5 years ago." Rain rolled in quietly overnight, soaking the auction grounds and casting the entire property in a curtain of gray mist. The morning felt still, too still. Brixley stood near the stables with her coat pulled tight, watching the clouds drift low over the trees. Inside, Willow was agitated. Not panicked, but tense. Her muscles twitched beneath her damp coat, and her eyes never left the far gate. Ash pressed close to her side, sensing something even his young mind couldn't understand. Animals always knew before humans did. And this morning, they knew something was coming. Inside the auction office, Sheriff Thalric reviewed the emergency injunction he'd just signed. "This'll hold for 72 hours, he told Brixley and Jorvan. "But we need more than family disputes if this goes to court. We need documented proof that Rylandor falsified ownership or mistreated animals under his care." Jorvan handed over an old, leather-bound ledger. "These are the breeding records. Willow's bloodline, Ash's parentage, everything. And Rylandor's name is nowhere in it." Across town, in a sleek glass-walled office far removed from the muddy stalls of Black Hollow, Rylandor Vexgate stared at his phone screen, seething. The video had spread like wildfire. Over 200,000 views in 12 hours, and the comments were damning. "Monster. Abuser. This isn't how you treat life." He scrolled through them with a cold smile. Sympathy was weakness. Public outrage, he believed, could be bought off or buried. He made a single phone call. "Activate Duskmore," he said simply. Hours later, Kavrin Duskmore, Rylandor's longtime legal strategist and fixer, arrived at the auction grounds. Dressed in a black trench coat and carrying a briefcase that looked more like a weapon than an accessory, Kavrin approached Masric Flintmere directly. "This facility is now under legal inspection," he announced, voice low and even. "Any interference with Rylandor Vexgate's property will result in immediate litigation." Behind him, a private security team emerged from black SUVs, ready to seize control. Masric stammered, caught between moral instinct and contractual obligation. But before he could speak, Dexlan Crowhurst stepped out from the shadows, camera in hand. "Smile, gentlemen," he said calmly. "You're live." Kavrin's jaw tightened. Brixley and Jorvan arrived seconds later, with Thalric behind them, badge visible. Willow neighed loudly from inside the stable, her voice echoing across the grounds. A line had been drawn. Not with words, but with truth, silence, and stares. And somewhere deep within the storm clouds, fate began to crack like distant thunder. Louder than any gavel, colder than any law. Lightning flashed over the pasture as the storm rolled in fast and hard, soaking the auction grounds in sheets of silver rain. Mud pooled around boots and tires, and visibility dropped to a blur. Inside the stable, Willow grew more restless, her hooves stamping against the wet straw, ears flicking in every direction. Ash nuzzled against her, confused and frightened, while thunder cracked like a whip overhead. Something primal stirred in the mare's chest, a warning centuries older than any fence or gate. Outside, the standoff had become a storm of its own. Kavrin Duskmore's legal team presented forged papers. Sheriff Thalric countered with signed breeding records. Brixley stood between them, soaked and shaking, but unwavering. "You have no moral right to that foal," she told Rylandor, her voice cutting through the rain like steel. "You don't even know what it means to protect something that depends on you." Rylandor stepped forward, his stare like polished ice. "Protection is weakness, Ms. Thorncroft. That colt was born to obey. And if not me, then someone worse will break him." He nodded to one of his men, who started moving toward the stable with a halter in hand. The crowd, what was left of it, began to murmur. Dexland's live stream was still rolling. Over 2 million people were watching now. And then it happened. A crash echoed from inside the stable. Wood splitting, metal clanging, hooves tearing against wet earth. Willow burst through the side gate, her body slick with rain and fury. She didn't run blindly. She charged straight at Rylandor's handler, placing herself between Ash and the chaos once again. Ash bolted after her, slipping slightly in the mud but keeping close. Willow reared, her front hooves slicing the air, a scream erupting from her lungs that sounded more like a mother mourning than a beast afraid. The handler backed off, slipping in the mud, eyes wide with panic. Rylandor froze. Everyone froze. No one moved, except for Willow, who stood like a statue in front of her foal, every inch of her soaked body trembling, ready to fight anyone who dared come near. For the first time, Rylandor Vexgate looked unsure. Not because of the law. Not because of the cameras. But because something in that mare's eyes reached back into a part of him that he had buried long ago. Something raw. Something real. Something he could never control. And in that moment, as thunder roared and the sky split open above them, even he knew. She would die before letting him take her child. The rain had eased into a soft drizzle, but tension still weighed heavier than the clouds. Willow and Ash stood near the broken stable gate, breathing hard, their bodies soaked, but eyes blazing with defiance. The crowd remained silent. No one dared move. Caveran Duskmore had retreated, quietly making calls, recalculating. Thalric stood with his hand near his belt, not threatening, but ready. Brixley hadn't said a word in minutes. She was watching Rylandor, watching his armor begin to crack. Then, through the mist, came the sound of boots on gravel. Slow, deliberate, deliberate. All heads turned. A tall figure in a weathered coat and wide-brimmed hat walked toward them with the weight of memory on his shoulders. His name was Corvian Wraithmore, and even Rylandor's face lost its color when he saw him. Corvian had been the Ashridge estate's legal steward decades ago, before Rylandor changed his name, before the power, before the lies. "Didn't expect to see you again," Rylandor muttered, his voice barely audible. Corvian nodded, stopping a few feet from the group. "That's the problem with the past, Ree. It always arrives when your back's turned." He reached into his coat and pulled out a thin leather folder, aged and brittle. Original land deeds. Breeding contracts. A signed document from your father stating that all Ashridge foals are protected from forced separation until the age of 1. And you forfeited your claim when you left the estate. Caveran stepped forward. "Those documents won't hold in federal court." Corvian raised an eyebrow. "They won't have to. Because a digital copy was already sent to the Department of Agriculture's Animal Welfare Division." He turned to Thalric. Along with a signed affidavit from a former stable hand who witnessed Rylandor's methods firsthand. "You'll find bruising records, sedation logs, and at least 3 undocumented removals." A wave of murmurs rippled through the onlookers. Rylandor took a step back, the water dripping from his coat collar unnoticed. His grip on control, on the narrative, was slipping. "You're trying to destroy me," he growled. "No," Corvian said quietly. "You did that yourself." Ash let out a small, curious snort, breaking the silence. Willow remained still, her body angled slightly in front of her son, but her breathing had softened. The war, for the first time, felt like it was turning. And yet, even as Rylandor's empire began to crumble around him, his eyes shifted toward Ash, and something darker flickered there. He wasn't finished. Not yet. The air had turned still again, that strange quiet that sometimes comes before something breaks. Corvian's revelation was still sinking in. The legal grounds were clear now, but the emotional battleground had only just begun. Rylandor Vexgate stood drenched, humiliated, and cornered. Everything he had built, his persona, his control, his legacy, was unraveling in front of a live audience. but what most couldn't see was the flicker in his eyes. Not defeat. Something else. Desperation. Without warning, Rylandor moved. He lunged toward Willow and Ash, not with subtlety or reason, but with fury. It was as if he meant to seize them by sheer force, to reclaim whatever power had just slipped through his fingers. The crowd gasped. Brixley shouted his name. Thalric reached for his sidearm. But none of them got there first. Willow did. She reared up again, hooves slashing through the air, but Rylandor dodged. It was Ash who stepped forward this time, instinctively, clumsily, but with unmistakable resolve. He pushed himself between his mother and the man, trembling but unyielding. He didn't buck or bolt. He just stood there, chest heaving as if to say, "Enough," and somehow that did what words and laws could not. Rylandor froze, inches from the colt. His breath came in ragged gasps, his soaked clothes clinging to him like shame. Ash's eyes met his, and something passed between them. Something ancient. Something that belonged not to humans, but to the wild. The unbroken. The free. Thalric stepped in then, hand firm on Rylandor's shoulder, pulling him back. "That's enough," he said, not with anger, but finality. Kavrin didn't resist. The legal team quietly began packing up. Whatever case they thought they had was already ashes in the wind. Dexland's camera continued rolling, capturing every second. And in that moment, millions watched a man unravel at the hooves of the very creature he tried to tame. Brixley rushed to Willow and Ash, her hands steady despite the adrenaline racing through her. She checked the colt for injuries, but found none. He pressed his head into her coat, letting out a deep, shaky breath. Willow lowered her head too, nudging Brixley gently, as if to say thank you, but also, we're not finished yet. Because across the field, Rylandor didn't leave. He stood in the rain, soaked and silent, eyes fixed on the horses he'd failed to control. And behind his silence, a storm still brewed. Not in the sky, but inside a man who had nothing left to lose. The storm passed overnight, leaving behind the scent of wet hay and a silence that felt earned. Morning sun filtered through the broken boards of the old stable, casting golden light across the backs of Willow and Ash, who stood huddled together, finally resting. For the first time in days, neither flinched at the sound of approaching footsteps. They knew something had changed. The danger was no longer pressing. But the scars remained, etched not on their bodies, but on something deeper. Outside, Brixley Thorncroft stood with Sheriff Thalric, watching animal control officers escort Rylandor's legal team off the property. Rylandor himself had been detained for violating federal animal welfare statutes. It wasn't a long-term sentence, but it was enough to strip his rights to own or trade livestock indefinitely. For a man like him, that was a far worse punishment than jail. He left the auction grounds under a gray sky, silent, unshaven, no longer a symbol of dominance, but of ruin. In the wake of Rylandor's collapse, the community stirred. Ranchers who had once envied or feared him now stepped forward with their own stories. Silent glances turned to testimonies. Hidden injuries in their herds. Suspicious disappearances. With Dexland's footage still circling the internet, the world had stopped pretending cruelty was someone else's burden. But it wasn't just about justice. It was about healing. Jorvan Ashridge stood near the old pasture fence, watching Willow graze while Ash clumsily attempted to mimic her movements. His weathered hands gripped the rails, but his heart felt lighter. For years, he had believed that letting Rylandor go was the right thing. Let him chase money. Let him change his name. But now, watching the colt he never expected to protect, he realized that silence had a cost. And some names, some bonds, should never be erased. Brixley approached him, muddy boots and tired eyes. "They're not just horses," she said quietly. Jorvan smiled. "No, they're not." At the edge of the field, Tavrik Hollowind waited with a trailer door open. He had offered his family's land, once a sanctuary for neglected animals, as a home for Willow and Ash. It wasn't charity. It was redemption. For him. For all of them. Willow lifted her head and looked at the open gate, then at Brixley. There was no fear in her eyes now. Only trust. As Ash trotted behind his mother toward the trailer, his legs stronger, his stride steadier. No one said a word. Because the battle was over. But the story wasn't finished just yet. 3 months later, autumn had begun to settle across the hills of Hollowend Ranch, painting the trees in shades of amber and rust. The mornings were crisp, the air clean, and the wind carried only the sounds of nature. No engines, no shouting, no fear. At the far end of the pasture, Willow stood beneath a tall sycamore tree, her coat shimmering in the early light. Nearby, Ash galloped freely, stronger now, taller, his stride smooth and confident. He wasn't a foal anymore. He was becoming something else, a survivor with spirit intact. Brixley Thorncroft leaned against the fence, a thermos of coffee in her hand, watching the two with quiet pride. The nightmares that once haunted her had softened. She still woke early, but now it was to check on Ash, not from explosions in her mind. She hadn't planned to stay on the ranch, but Taverick had offered her a guest room in the old caretaker's house. She never left. Somehow, those horses had stitched something back together inside her, something she didn't even know was broken. Inside the barn, Taverick Hollowend organized supplies while talking to a small group of volunteers. Word had spread after the incident at Black Hollow, and now people came from out of state to learn, to help, to heal. The ranch had become more than a refuge. It had become a symbol. Willow and Ash were no longer just animals. They were the heart of a story that changed people, that reminded them of the power of instinct, of sacrifice, of love without condition. Further up the hill, Jorvan Ashridge visited the grave of his father for the first time in years. He didn't speak, but he didn't have to. The land had forgiven him. The family name, once overshadowed by Rylandor's ambition, had found new meaning. Rylandor, now stripped of title and influence, had vanished from the public eye. No one knew where he'd gone. And for the first time, Jorvan didn't care. Back at the pasture, Ash approached Brixley at the fence, nosing her hand for attention. She laughed softly, pressing her forehead to his. "You're going to be trouble when you're full-grown," she whispered. He neighed, as if in agreement, and trotted back to Willow, who glanced back once more before returning to her grazing. The wind shifted, carrying the scent of hay and old pine. And as the sun rose higher over the fields, casting golden light across the hills, it was clear. Some battles don't end with victory, they end with understanding. And in the quiet spaces where pain once lived, something wild had been allowed to stay wild, and that changed everything.